Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new track review video where I get to talk about some recently released songs that I happened to hear in the past couple weeks or so, and just share my thoughts on them pretty much. The first track I'm going to be talking about today is this newest track from Slipknot, Unsainted. When it comes to Slipknot as a whole, I would consider myself a pretty moderate fan of the group. They have some material that I like, but they also have some other material I just don't really care for that much. And when it comes to this track, I'm pretty indifferent towards it. There's aspects to this track I enjoy, but there's other aspects that I don't really care for that much. Probably my favorite part of this track is the hook of the song. I like Corey's clean vocals on this, and I think it's just a pretty catchy, well put together hook for the most part. Not one of the best that the band has ever put together, but still, it's pretty enjoyable. I don't really care for some of the choir-like vocals that are put into the background of the hook at times on the track. I don't think the rest of the song is nearly as grand enough as it needs to be in order to have these vocals work in the mix, because it just sounds a bit cheesy and over the top, but like not in a way that I think adds to the track. But you know, for the most part, I think the hook is a pretty solid part of this track. Really, everything else outside of the hook, though, I don't really care for as much. Not that any of it is like awful or anything, but it just tends to be really generic and boring sounding for the most part. The more aggressive vocals that Corey does during the verses of the track are just kind of standard for him at this point. They don't really stand out as being particularly aggressive or ear-catching or anything like that. The instrumental is also pretty boring as well, and I'm not the biggest fan of how it's all put together and mixed, really. All the guitars and bass just kind of sound like one big instrument in the mix, and the drums, while the performance on the drums is really solid on the track, the way it's mixed into the track, once again, just feels kind of flat overall. It doesn't really add a ton of aggression or like genuine feel to the song that I think it really needs in order to sell a lot of the emotion and anger that's trying to be conveyed in this track. Overall, the instrumental to it is just pretty standard when it comes to how it's composed and what sound they're going for here. However, I think it's the way it's put together here in this song that just kind of holds it back even more so. So, yeah, I think the track is decent overall. Like, it's not one that I'm going to return to a whole ton, but it's not terrible either. The vocal performance during the hook is easily the best part, as I said before, but everything else really does just hold the track back a fair bit. Moving on, however, we're going to be talking about this new track from Waterparks, Turbulent. I believe this track is going to be on their upcoming third studio album, and considering I've liked both albums that this band has dropped in the past, I was pretty interested to see what they were going to do with some new material of their own for their third record. This track overall does have a bit of a different sound from what they were doing on either of the two albums they dropped previously. It has a bit of a darker tone overall, which is something that I can get behind, considering I think when it comes to their last two records, or at least their second record, while I did like that second record of theirs, I think its biggest flaw was that at times it was a bit too similar to the first record in terms of its overall tone and style. This track is definitely trying to be a bit more different, which is something on a very surface level I could at least appreciate. However, outside of this darker tone that the track tries to go for that, you know, on a very general level I like, a lot of the performances and sound present on this track I don't really care for at all, unfortunately. The track tries to be a bit more electronic in tone compared to some of the stuff that the band has done in the past, and while the band has, you know, dipped their toes into some different electronic sounds at various points, they've always kept a nice mix, I feel, of some of the poppier electronic elements and some of the more rock elements. Here on this track, it's mostly electronic sounding, and while I don't necessarily dislike it for that reason alone, I don't feel like they mix these elements into their core sound in a way that works very nicely. You do have some guitar parts that pop up here on this track that sound pretty decent, but outside of that, a lot of the rest of the track has a very stiff electronic feel to it that I just don't think works a lot with the band's overall sound. The drums here on this track sound very stiff, almost programmed in a way, and it's not a terrible programmed sound, I guess, if that's what they were going for, but once again, I'm not the biggest fan of the stiffness of it, and I just don't feel like it adds to the darker, aggressive tone they were trying to go for here. And the vocals on the track I don't really like either. Just how manipulated and auto-tuned they are here throughout this track. It's clearly being done in a way where you're supposed to be aware of the fact that it's being manipulated just with how obvious it is, but at least for me personally, when it comes to vocal manipulations, they need to, you know, for one thing, have a purpose in the track, and two, they have to sound good. And while they certainly seem to be trying to go for having a purpose here in this track, they don't really sound good. In fact, I think they take a lot of the natural grit out of the vocals here that I think would be really good to have on this track that's trying to be a bit darker. Lyrically, this track is a breakup song with a lot of bitterness and anger in it, and I feel like manipulating the vocals as much as they are here on this track removes a lot of that emotion from them and leaves something that sounds a bit more robotic overall, which just doesn't really work all that nicely with the rest of the tone of the song. I think having some just more natural sounding vocals on this thing would have made it a lot better. So overall, I think this track is kind of underwhelming, unfortunately. I think the general direction that the band's trying to move for here in this track, having a bit of a darker tone, is a pretty good one, and I like the fact that at the very least this track sounds different than what they were doing on their last record. However, at the same time, like I said before, I really don't care for a lot of the sounds the band is trying to go for here on this track. I don't really like how stiff and electronic it comes across at times, especially considering that lyrically this track is trying to be a bit more angry and aggressive and in your face. I don't feel like the two sounds mix together very nicely, and the track just ends up feeling a bit awkward as a result of this. Even some of the best parts of the sound of this track, like the guitar parts or the kind of noisy outro that this track has, are just pretty okay in the grander scheme of Waterparks' discography. It's a song I didn't really care for personally. Maybe it'll grow on me in the context of whatever record it comes out in, and I do hope that at the very least that this band continues with some of this darker sound on this third record of theirs, but overall, yeah, I didn't personally care for this song all too much. Next, I want to talk about this new track from Baroness, Throw Me an Anchor. And one thing I want to say before talking about this track itself is that with the last couple singles that the band has released from their upcoming record, a problem I had with those couple of tracks I didn't really spend a whole ton of time talking about in my track reviews of them was the production. Mostly because I don't feel like it was that big of a problem. And I mean, even the band's last record had some pretty spotty production, a sound that was kind of underdeveloped. It sounded kind of demo-like at times. However, I still liked their last album quite a bit, and the two tracks that they dropped prior to this one, at least the first track, Borderlines, I thought was still pretty great when it came to the composition of the track, and Seasons, I thought was kind of underwhelming, but that was mostly because of the actual composition of the song as opposed to the production. The reason I bring this up is because I think on this new track of theirs, this is kind of like finally the point where the production is really starting to become a big problem when it comes to my enjoyment of this track, because when it comes to the actual composition of this song and what the band is trying to do with the sound of the track, it's pretty solid overall. It's pretty good. I like the hook of the track and how catchy it is. The overall structure of this track is pretty interesting. It should be a song that I like quite a bit. However, the production really holds this thing back, unfortunately. And I get personally that a lot of metal music out there is supposed to have a very raw and lo-fi style of production if the music itself is supposed to be very aggressive and raw, but that's not really the case with Baroness's most recent output. I feel like this is a kind of style of metal that would benefit a lot from having a more clear sounding production that would really allow all the instruments to do their own thing and be heard in the mix and really flourish. This isn't really supposed to be very raw, aggressive music or something like that. And unfortunately, the production just doesn't really work with the style of music they're trying to go for here on this song. In particular, the opening to this track where you have the guitars and the drums and all that coming in, it sounds awful. Like, it sounds even worse than like what I would expect to hear from like a demo that they'd release or something like that. It's just painful on the ears with the style of production they have here. It's just unpleasant in every sense of the word. As the track progresses, it does become a bit more tolerable overall. It does sink into a similar style and feel that tracks like Seasons and Borderlines had going for them. However, the start of this track really just does leave a bad taste in my mouth, unfortunately. And overall, as a result of that, this is easily my least favorite track that the band has released from this upcoming album of theirs, and probably one of my least favorite tracks that the band has released to date. It's still not an awful song or anything. I mean, like I said, the actual composition of the track itself is pretty solid. Everyone, when it comes to their performances on the track, are pretty good as well. It really just is the production that ruins this track overall, which is unfortunate considering this band, given how popular they are, should be able to have some better production here. But yeah, unfortunately, that's just how things ended up being here on this track. Moving on, though, the next track we're going to be talking about is this new Chance the Rapper track, GRoCERIES, which, when it comes to Chance the Rapper and my history with him and his music, I would consider myself a moderate fan of his. I like some of the material he's put out. I've never really been in love with any of his full-length projects, though, as unpopular as an opinion as that might be. However, at the very least, I've been able to appreciate the fact that the guy has constantly been able to bring something new to the table with every project that he's dropped. Because Chance has always had his personality on display on his projects, the fact that this new track here is as boring as it is pretty surprising to me personally. This song is pretty much just a boring, typical trap rap track that just happens to have Chance the Rapper on it, I feel. Like, nothing about the track is inherently super terrible or anything, but at the same time it's so bland and boring that I just don't care for it at all, really. The beat to this track is pretty uninteresting. It's just pretty bland overall. It doesn't really have a ton of energy to it either. The performances on the verses here, whether it be from Chance or the featured artist, are pretty bland as well. They don't really have a lot of personality coming through here on these verses, and it just feels really typical at the end of the day to me. Nothing about this track really stands out all that much. I would have appreciated this track a bit more, I feel, if maybe the performers or the production brought a bit more energy and excitement to the track, but that's just not the case here, because while all the performances across this thing are, I guess, fine enough, none of them have a ton of energy to them. It just kind of feels like everything about this track is on autopilot. And lyrically, the track doesn't have a ton going on in it either, which I feel like is what it was going to need to have if, the actual energy on the track and the production wasn't really all there, which, it isn't. So, yeah, I mean, when it comes to the overall vibe and sound of this track, I mean, it's not incompetent. I mean, the beat is put together decently enough, the performances are fine enough, but it's still just such a boring song. There's so little personality coming through on this track. There's absolutely no energy, no interesting or creative bars, or even like funny or interesting bars on this thing either. It's just boring. Overall, I really didn't care for this track. I just found it super boring personally. But yeah, that really covers everything I want to talk about here in today's video. If you have an opinion of your own on any of these tracks, feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. And thank you guys for watching once again, and stay golden.